to the official podcast of DogsDaily.com, a Sports Illustrated channel.
Gets to the edge. Sonny Michel will send the Dogs home to the championship game.
If you're looking for the latest Georgia Bulldog news in football, basketball, baseball, and recruiting, then you're in the right place.
Anthony Edwards with the jam. Are you kidding me?
Hosted by Dogs Daily writers Jeremiah Stoddard, Kyle Funderburk, and Jonathan Williams.
Here's a pitch. Hit high out into right center with some carry. It's got a chance. This ball is out of here. Tucker Bradley has won it.
Just sit back, relax, and prepare yourself for these hot takes you're about to listen to.
Welcome back, everybody, for another episode of Classic City Sports. As always, Jeremiah Stoddard here, along with my buddy Jonathan Williams, and we're excited today. We get to bring you our preview episode for the Georgia-Clemson game for September 4th, and right now it is September 1st, 7:40 right now, so this episode should be up for you on the 2nd, sometime early enough in the day, so you can have plenty of time to absorb as much of it as possible before we kick off on Saturday. I can't be more excited about it. The anticipation is building massively. So we will go into a good bit of detail into the game and some key areas that we think are something you should pay attention to. For starters, there's a couple position groups we think are going to have a huge impact on the outcome of the game. Some different little things like that we're going to break into. We'll get some predictions for the game, for the overall outcome of it. We'll give some season predictions, maybe even a couple of player predictions for the year for Georgia as well. And then y'all can keep up with it and see how accurate we are by the end of the year. But I did want to start with one thing, and that is there is a article that Jonathan was actually just telling me about before we came on here, and it was by ESPN that had a hot take of all hot takes of how this season was going to go for some teams and who was or wasn't making the playoffs at the end of the year. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to you. Just kind of give us a brief rundown of what they said was going to happen.
So I get this notification from ESPN. It was like, our predictions for every Power 5 conference this year. And so they have like 3 of their predictions of what's going to happen within the conference. And then, of course, they had their predictions for every single team that's going through the season. And the ACC was first. And so they had Clemson at 11-1 with them actually losing to Georgia in the season opener. And then I keep on reading and it says, of course, they win the conference. They don't have much competition there. But the interesting note was that they win the conference and they run the table and everything else, but they don't make the playoff is what they predict. And so then I'm wondering, I'm like, who in the heck is going in over Clemson? Like, do they have like Iowa State and Oklahoma both going in? Because we've seen how there's been quite a few people to throw in Iowa State right now. And I get all the way to the bottom with the Pac-12, and they have Oregon actually coming back into the college football playoff. First time since 2015 that we just went and researched, actually. You had Washington in the first one in 2014, and then you had Oregon the following year against Florida State the next year. But it's just crazy to me because – so then the other teams were Oklahoma, Georgia, and Alabama. They had both of those in there. They had Georgia going undefeated, losing to Alabama in the SEC championship game. So then both Alabama and Georgia went on to the college football playoff. But I was very confused because the confusing part to me was that they had Oregon at 10-2, losing 2 games, winning the conference, and getting put in over Clemson. But Clemson was 11-1, won their conference, and their only loss was to ranked top 4 Georgia, but yet they don't make it. That was the part that really didn't make sense to me. And me and you both agreed that in that scenario, it doesn't matter if Clemson loses it loses the season opener. If they run the table with the ACC and win their conference, 11-1 team that's Clemson is going to get put in, especially if it's a close game with Georgia as well.
Yeah, and that's how I think it's going to be. I do think it's going to be a close game, and I'll save that like full prediction of how I think that goes for the tail end area. So if you're waiting for that, you're going to have to wait for a little while. Stick around. But that I do think it's a good game, and so that means they're going to be competitive, win or lose. So in this scenario, they're losing. you're going to have them run the table in the ACC like they do every year and be an ACC champion and not put the ACC champ. There is snowball's chance in hell that they don't put Clemson in after winning the ACC championship with their one loss being to a top 4 team in Georgia as well, and then putting the Pac-12 in there, who Oregon was 4-3 last year. They only played 7 games, and one of them was their conference championship, and they literally went 4-3. They weren't supposed to be in their own conference championship. They weren't supposed to be there, and they ended up winning it because they snuck in because of a COVID issue. And you're going to say that they get put in instead? Like there's 0% chance that a Pac-12 team makes the playoffs this year.
Yeah, and their only argument for the reason why Clemson would make it is because they had a weak schedule for the rest of the year. Well,
what kind of schedule does the Pac-12 and Oregon have?
Yeah, and Clemson has a weak regular season schedule usually every year, unless they play
Always.
a Notre Dame or like a ranked 20 Miami, who's still questionable usually to even be ranked at the time. So I mean, you're talking about a team that has been in the college football playoff year after year after year after year, and all of a sudden, just because they slip up against a ranked team, they find like a top 4 team in this scenario, they're all of a sudden kicked out. I just don't see that happening because, I mean, I don't really know, but it's just if Clemson if your one loss is to a ranked top 4 team, and then you run the table everywhere else, I mean, you did enough, in my opinion, to be in the college football playoff, especially when you're a prestigious team like Clemson. I mean, just my opinion.
Well, it's experience. It shows what they've done in the past, where they've been able to get, and then you're going to say that one hiccup at the beginning of the first game of the season is going to keep them out of the playoffs when they run the table. When you first started saying it and you said that they weren't going to make the playoffs after losing to Georgia, my first instinct was I asked you, I said, are they saying they're going to lose to North Carolina in the ACC championship game?
That's what I thought too.
And if they win, and I do think North Carolina is a decent team this year, and so if they play North Carolina in the ACC championship game and they win and still only have one loss in the entire season, there's no way that they keep them out. That would be like keeping an SEC champion out of the playoffs, even if they had 2 losses or something like that. That would still be the same thing as keeping them out. Because they're not going to – Clemson's, if they go undefeated or a 1 loss at the very beginning of the season and win their conference, they will be in the playoffs the same way that the argument's always made right now is, are there 2 SEC teams in the playoffs this year? It's going to be the same thing. So – and I do think that North Carolina should get enough credit to where that's a decent win if they get there and win that game like I do think they will. So they should get credit for that in the sense of their strength of schedule because that's probably one of their best games.
Yeah.
And once again, if you're going to use strength of schedule as your argument, with their 1 loss coming to a top 4 team and then winning their conference and getting there, but then you're going to put in a Pac-12 team with 2 losses. And who's their where's their Goliath over there as far as like their strength of schedule? Who in the Pac-12 the top to bottom just screams a stronger strength of schedule than Clemson has in the ACC. The difference with the ACC and Pac-12 is at least the ACC has Clemson and maybe North Carolina's creeping back up there again to be competitive. The other side of it is Pac-12 doesn't even have 1 team.
Yeah, no.
They don't. Now, maybe USC makes, strides for the, making a better argument for themselves as being a strong competitor. Maybe Oregon is getting better, but you cannot sit there and say that top to bottom their strength of schedule is so much better that a Clemson 1-loss team to Georgia in this scenario isn't going to be in the playoffs.
Yeah, and I would have
that's clickbait.
I would have understood maybe. I think the only way in that scenario where a 1-loss Clemson doesn't make the playoff is if somewhere in the regular season they play a Boston College or another kind of typical bottom tier team in the ACC that they struggle with, like they did last year against Boston College. They beat them by 1 touchdown. If they have multiple games like that where they are continuing to struggle against teams that they should be beating by multiple scores, then possibly you could start saying okay, well, they had a really weak strength of schedule, and even there they kind of struggled a little bit. That's a maybe.
But they do that anyway.
Yeah, and
they always do
that's
that.
A maybe.
They were in that situation last year, but their excuse for it last year was Trevor Lawrence was out for Notre Dame, and against Boston College, which was a one-score game. And Notre Dame was at least a top 5 team at the time. I think they were top 4 at the time when they did that. So they had the argument on their side with that, but they still struggled against North Carolina. They had some games like that. They have those games every year.
Typically, everybody does. I mean,
typically
it's a
everybody
long
does.
Season.
Right, and every once in a while, a team catches you a little bit slack. Like you're sitting back on your heels, and all of a sudden they're coming downhill at you, and you have to respond. I mean, it happens to Georgia. It happens to Alabama. We've seen Alabama almost lose games that they shouldn't lose at all. But guess what? They still end up in the playoffs. They still win the national championship because that one game, as long as they can win it, doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't one of the top 4 teams or one of the better teams in the country when it's all said and done, because they struggled at one game, especially early in the season. And actually, shout out to the Dogcast here and Jamie Goodman, because I listened to their most recent episode yesterday or the day before yesterday. I don't remember what, a couple days ago maybe. And they had Todd Gurley on the show. So check that out. It was a pretty good interview. And Todd came on there and he actually talked about, Georgia in this game, win or lose kind of thing. And he said, I mean, if they lose in the first game, I don't think it's that big of a deal because right now losing early in the season is the way to do it.
Yeah, it is.
It gives people time to forget what happened at the beginning of the season because they can see the entire body of work behind it. And so you have time to avenge that loss, without a better way to say it. You have time to show people that was a slip up and that you're a better team and that you deserve to be in that conversation for a national championship. So if it's the first game of the year, they lose to Georgia in a close game, and then they run the table the rest of the way.
They're in the
strength of schedule is going to keep them out. No, it's not. If strength of schedule was a problem for Clemson, they wouldn't have been in the playoffs like as many times recently in general. The ACC hasn't had that schedule for them in general. So I don't know where that argument comes in. I think it's like what you said. It's clickbait. It's something like that.
It's probably to get people like us riled up.
Well, think about it. It was the ACC went first on that list, right?
Yeah.
You were engaged immediately into that article.
Oh, yeah. I went through the whole article.
Because of that one thing, though.
And, I mean,
Pac-12
at the bottom,
everyone
ACC
knows how it
at
works.
The top.
You know how it works. They're going to, at that point, they know that they're going to get you to keep going through the whole thing. And guess what? It sparked conversation. We're sitting here talking about it.
Exactly.
We spent 10 minutes talking about it already. I thought it would be fun to talk about because, it's just.
It's worth noting, yeah. It's very relevant to this game now.
It's very relevant to this game. And we'll let that be our season ending or our off-season ending talking season segment. We'll let that be that one for you because the ESPN talking season is coming to an end too. They'll have to defend that later on kind of thing. But it's one of those things, man. There's so many people on ESPN and other news outlets and social media, all that kind of stuff that just make outlandish comments to get people's attention and get clicks, all that kind of stuff on there. And that's fine. I'm not hating on them for it. If they want to do it and it works, they get their, what they're trying to get out of it. More power to them. I'm not hating on it. It is what it is. But one thing that everyone has been bringing up as well, just because we're on the topic of other teams and playoff stuff real quick before we get into going deeper into the actual matchup with Clemson, was, like you mentioned a second ago, a lot of people are thinking that Iowa State is one of the top 4 teams this year. Even Josh Pate, who I like Josh Pate a lot, actually, and he seems to be pretty straightforward and accurate with what he thinks most of the time. But he's calling for an Iowa State top 4 team this year.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not on board. Don't get me wrong. I agree with a lot of the stuff he says. I disagree with this one because I just don't think that's how that goes. No. I don't think that they're going to edge out. I think there's going to be 2 SEC teams in there this year, whether it be a Georgia, Alabama, or like a Bama and even a Texas A&M right now, or somebody like that sneaks in. I think there's high probability 2 SEC teams are in there, which means you've got Clemson as the 3rd, and then most likely, because who's going to stop them? Oklahoma for the 4th.
Yep.
I'll put an official one in the atmosphere by the end of the episode, and I'll tell you who my 4 are at that point to wrap everything up as well. But without further ado, we will go ahead and jump into the actual matchup that you're here to listen to right now with Clemson and what Georgia looks like against them. What we're kind of looking at as far as key positions to watch, position groups, is what I'll really say, because I do think there is a very pivotal spot, position group wise, that's going to decide the game, and it's going to come down to who performs the best in that area for you. And But I'll go ahead and kick it over to you. Let's start from the top real quick, and just the quarterback is a huge factor for both teams because Trevor Lawrence is gone, so you've got DJU, and I'm calling him DJU because ESPN did that too the other day, and I was listening to it. I'm not trying to say this man's last name and butcher it because I know I will, and I'm not going to get caught on camera doing that. But DJU versus JT Daniels. So that's the first matchup to kind of look at, and one's not going to obviously mean the other one doesn't do well because they're not going head-to-head, on the field at the same time. But just kind of your brief overview of what you look at when you look at both of those quarterbacks right now.
Well, I mean, we were kind of talking about this before the show, is that DJ and JT Daniels are both pretty much in the same situation of how, based on like last season compared to this year, DJ got to appear in a few more games. He only started 2. JT Daniels started in 4 games towards the end of the season. And they pretty much put up similar stat lines based on the games that they played in. And so really the thing that it boils down to when you're talking about quarterback play, and especially when 2 offenses who are expected to be very explosive this year and will be, both of these offenses are very talented and are going to put up a lot of points this year, you have to look at which teams are going to take care of the ball more, especially in the passing attack. And honestly, me and you both agree that DJ is probably the better quarterback in that aspect of taking care of the ball.
As far as taking care of the ball,
yes.
Not just the better quarterback.
Yeah, I'm not saying that
sure
DJ
clear.
is better than JT, but just in that aspect. And because you want the most opportunities, of course, to take the ball down the field and score. And so turning the ball over is killer for things like that, especially when you're a neck and neck game going back and forth. All it takes is one stop. So just in that aspect, it's just because JT Daniels, as we've seen before, I mean, he's been this way since his freshman year at USC, is that he takes chances and he trusts himself and he trusts his wide receivers, which is a great thing. You want your quarterback to have all the trust in the world in your teammates and in your players, but it also can lead to some costly mistakes. So and JT Daniels could very well also go this game without even throwing a single interception. DJ could do the same as well, or DJ could throw an interception and JT Daniels doesn't. So, but just in regards to the quarterback position, if you're looking at those two and you're comparing them, that'd be the one aspect of both of their games that I would be watching during the game to really determine that position battle specifically.
For sure. And the reason we bring this up too is, one, because the quarterback is everyone's main focus at first when you start looking at a matchup, that you start looking at the starting quarterbacks. The second part is because somebody did ask us who we thought was going to do a better job in this game at protecting the ball. And realistically, just because, like what you said, after watching him at USC, watching him in Georgia, and just kind of seeing his play style, I do think that JT is going to be a little bit looser with it. He's a little bit more fearless, right? Like, he has that confidence, that swagger, that he's not scared to throw it into a tight spot because he has a lot of confidence in his arm for good reason. He has a lot of talent, and he can put the ball exactly where he wants to. But that does lead to maybe he misread a defense and all of a sudden the safety comes flying from the left side that he didn't see, or a linebacker drifts right back into where he's trying to. Think about the Mississippi State game where he threw 400 yards and just went off. It was one of those things that he had a great performance, but there was early in the game. It was in the first, I want to say it was the first drive. I'll have to go back and watch to confirm, but he threw one and a linebacker dropped right back into it. It hit the linebacker basically in the chest, and he dropped it. And it would have changed the narrative of the whole game at that point if he had picked it off, because he should have picked it off. I mean, it hit him like right here, I swear. But that's just because he's just looking at that receiver and he's just trying to squeeze one in there real quick. There's nothing wrong with his play style. I do think that he's going to be extremely talented this year. I think he's going to lead Georgia an extremely long way this year as well. So it's worth mentioning that in the turnover battle, or maybe not necessarily turnover battle, but the potential for somebody not taking care of the ball as well as the other person is going to be, I think DJ has the advantage there. Now, when you look at the quarterback battle as a whole and like how it's going to impact the game, I will say this. Look back to last year, and yeah, you can make the argument. We talked about this too. Georgia versus Mississippi State had a similar kind of feel as well. And then Georgia versus Cincinnati, you can make somewhat of the same argument for. But think back to the games where DJ started last year. He started against, like you said earlier, Boston College, a game that they won by one score, one touchdown, and then Notre Dame, who they beat in overtime by they lost that game, didn't they? and that was with DJ throwing for 430-something yards, and they barely won in that game. It's because their defense didn't hold up. They gave up 40 points in that game. And then in the Boston College game, it was a lower scoring game than that, but he still threw for, I want to say, 360 yards, something like that when we looked at it earlier. And they struggled as a team. Now, once again, I know that Georgia went toe-to-toe with Mississippi State in the first start that JT had, where he threw for a ridiculous number of yards, all that good stuff. And then again against Cincinnati. But as a team as a whole, when you look at it, Georgia brings back a lot more than Clemson did in that regard, though, as far as a supporting cast goes. Like, you have, with Travis Etienne being gone, their run game is something that we have a lot of question marks about for Clemson as well. And Justin Ross is playing, but they have a couple other good receivers, don't get me wrong. But as far as a supporting cast, I like Georgia's chances as far as who's around JT Daniels on offense, that I think that it gives him the edge, because he has, to me, it's unmatched, the running back room, because they do have, a couple running backs at Clemson as well, but Georgia has a stable of running backs to support there in that area of it. The wide receiver room, there's been a lot of injuries, but they've recovered in a way that I don't think it's going to be the difference in the game. I think that Georgia has enough talent to step up in those position groups to where that won't be what decides the game for Georgia, losing or winning. I think that Georgia gets the advantage when it comes to the quarterback spot.
Yeah, and then I'll even take this even further, kind of put the quarterbacks aside, as you pointed out, offensive lines. And I've said that this is pretty much going to be a game that's predicated based on a battle of the trenches. Who's going to overpower who on both sides of the ball? Because you're probably talking about the top two front sevens in the nation this year, between Clemson and Georgia, between their linebackers and their defensive line. You can make a case that these are the top two front sevens. But I would also, even though I think maybe Clemson is a little more talented on the defensive line, I think Georgia has better linebackers, but I think Clemson might have the edge on the defensive line as of right now. I would say that I like Georgia's offensive line matchup against their offensive line than I do Clemson's O-line versus Georgia's defensive line. And so I think that begs a lot of question. Travis Etienne was their entire offense last year. And so now that you got pretty much two new guys getting rotated in there at running back, it begs the question of, can you get a run game started against Georgia's defense? Because, every single year, Georgia's run defense is top of the nation, off the charts, really, really good. So I don't think Clemson can put themselves in a position to where you're having to make DJ win you this game by throwing every single pass, unless you can kind of open up the run game somehow. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to hand it off, but if you can get your running backs involved at all. But I think that Georgia's offensive line matches up better against Clemson's defensive line than vice versa, in my opinion. So, but regardless, I think the trenches is going to be a very determining factor of who wins this game, without a doubt.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that as well, because that's my air position group to watch, or my battle to watch within the game, as far as what I do think leads to a win or a loss for either team on this, whether it's Georgia that wins or Clemson that wins. You're going to be able to look back on that and look at the performance from that front seven against the offensive lines. That's going to be the position battles to really determine the outcome of the game, because I think both sides at defensive back, even though Georgia has had its fair share of issues there, and where even on Sports Illustrated, Brooks, he wrote his article about the injuries for Georgia and who's in, out, that kind of thing, questionable, all that good stuff. And with Tyke Smith being ruled out, Georgia's going with most likely Bernee at that position at star, and so he's going to match up with Justin Ross most likely all game long. If he's on the field, that's where he's going to be, in the slot area, kind of putting him in the the spotlight. But I don't think that that's going to be the area that decides the game. I think both teams have good enough defensive backs to make up for wherever they have issues like that. Both teams have great wide receivers, so that matchup will be good, but I don't think it's going to be the deciding factor of it. The deciding factor is going to come down to the front seven, because that defensive line, that's because both teams have a big question mark at offensive line.
Yeah.
Both teams
There's
have a question
on both sides for them
at offensive line, and we'll get into that a little bit more in depth here in a minute as well. But that's the reason I say that, and because to go along with that, to pair with the fact that that's a position group that each team struggles with a little bit right now, both teams have probably the top 2 front sevens in the country. Georgia, I do think, has the better linebacking crew, which I think could be a difference maker in there. I think that Clemson, theoretically, if you look at it on paper, they might have the better defensive line, but defensive line, they might not have a certain player on their defensive line for Clemson, which could make a huge difference. And Georgia's really not missing anything on their defensive line at all. Their linebackers, to me, are a lot better than the others. So, I mean, you look at Nakobe and then like Quay Walker versus Balin Spector, which is number 10, I believe, and then James Skowski, who they're both good linebackers. Don't get me wrong, they are. But the reason I bring it up the way that I did is Brooks Austin did a film breakdown on linebackers.
Worth watching.
It's extremely worth watching.
Very eye-opening.
Oh, yeah. And one of the reason I bring it up as far as that spot, because I think the defensive line, I think Clemson technically is going to have it at full health if their entire defensive line is there. I think that they have the edge over Georgia at defensive line. Mm-hmm. But one, I'm not sure that they're going to be at full health at that spot. And two, they really they don't have that big of an edge. I think that the linebackers have a bigger difference. Like if you look at Georgia's linebackers versus middle linebackers. I'm saying middle linebackers because outside linebackers are basically edge rushers, not counting them in this discussion. I'm talking middle linebackers with the two that I just discussed there, along with Nakobe Dean and Quay Walker. Nakobe Dean and Quay Walker are going to play a lot better than Skowski and Spector.
Yeah.
That to me is a fact, and I think that could be a big deciding factor on it because, like you said, the question is going to be is how well can Clemson get that running game going against Georgia? Well, the linebackers play extremely well in the run defense for Georgia, and they're extremely fast because they'll close off the edges a lot faster than some of the other teams in the ACC will do against Clemson and their running backs there, which while we're talking about the Clemson running backs, by the way, somebody asked us about who we thought was going to be the starting running backs and who's going to get the bulk of the carries there. I mean, Clemson released their depth chart, and they kind of have it as an either-or kind of thing, but they're going to most likely be running out there with Lynn J. Dixon and then Kobe Pace. Lynn J. Dixon has, I mean, I looked up his stats stuff earlier and a little bit into his background. I think he was like 1,300 yards total, something like that. Lynn J., he's played a good bit, just it slowed down a lot last year because of ETN.
Yeah.
And so he didn't get as many carries last year. I think there's only like 2 games where he had more than 10 carries in his career, up to this point in the 3 years that he's been there. So he's a redshirt junior, I believe. And so he doesn't have a ton of carries and stuff in general, but he has put up a decent amount of yards. His freshman year is where he had his most of his success, about 530 yards, something like that year. And it kind of went downhill each year after that. But once again, because of Travis Etienne being their offense and being so strong that they had to put him in, that's where it made the difference for him. But I think he's going to be the one getting most of the carries. And for a guy that hasn't had a ton of experience, it's going to be a rough game for him up against Georgia's front seven.
Well, and then you touched on how Georgia's linebackers play a big part in the run stop for Georgia's defense. And actually, Nakobe Dean had something to say about this earlier, or the other day, or maybe it was today, where he said, well, yeah, we do a really good job in the run game, and it's because Jordan Davis eats up so many blocks that we pretty much have a hole to run through every single time. And so I think, of course, we've already said that Clemson's defense line is better, but I also say that only because we haven't really gotten to see Georgia's defensive line yet. I mean, we know who Jordan Davis is, and then you kind of know who Trevon Walker is, and you kind of know who Nolan Smith is. But we haven't gotten to see them really together on the field, see what they can do this year, see how they improve as well, because both of those guys have a lot of room for improvement. I think they both really improved this. I think you see Trevon Walker have a really good season this year. I think you see Nolan Smith have a really good season. And then also Georgia gets to let Adam Anderson just absolutely raise hell in the backfield this year.
He's, by the way, not to mean to cut you off there, he said he's going for 20 sacks.
It's a scary thing. I mean, anytime.
And he's not kidding.
No. And if you go back and just watch, he didn't play exactly a lot. He was not he didn't get a whole lot of snaps last year in regards to an every down player. He was more of a third down package type of guy. Go back and look at any of his plays last year. he was in the backfield every single time, disrupting something. I mean, the Auburn game alone, he had Bo Nix in pretty much in tears.
He lives in this man's nightmares now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now that you're letting him loose this season, and he just gets to do what he loves and get after people and basically see ball, get ball, that's a scary thing as well, especially when you have someone like Jordan Davis, like I said before, who just eats up blocks. You can't block him. You can't move him. And then also Devante Wyatt behind him, who doesn't get mentioned a whole lot just because of course, of who Jordan Davis is. But Devante Wyatt is also a really good interior defensive lineman as well. So I think Georgia is really good defensive line, and I think maybe down the road later this season, you could see them being the best defensive line in the nation as well. And I only say that just because as of right now, prior to the season, we don't really have a true read of what Georgia's defensive line is and how they're going to play. But I think they're going to play really, really well.
I agree. And the biggest question mark I think that we haven't really seen, to be fair, there's really only one that you haven't seen too much of, and that's Trevon Walker, who's going to play that defensive end, kind of setting the traditional defensive end for Georgia. But you've seen everything, pretty much everything. I don't even know why he came back. We've talked about this before, that Jordan Davis can do. The only thing that he didn't show much of is like pressuring the quarterback. So maybe that's what he's here to show again this year. And if that's the case, look out. Oh my God. If that's what he's trying to do this year, it's going to be rough for opposing centers and guards that have to face him all year long. And then quarterbacks that have to see him coming as well. But so you know what he's going to do. And then you still have Devante Wyatt, who we've seen a lot of over the few years, several years he's been there. And Nolan Smith hasn't really lived up to his hype of being the number one overall player coming out of high school thus far. But once again, we've talked about this before. It's kind of unfair when you have a guy like Azeez Ojulari playing in your position group that's really not going to get off the field at that point.
And it happens every year that we've seen an edge rusher for UGA every single year has an outbreak year. And so you don't know.
You can only have one basically at a time. And so like they're all talented. Just who's going to be slightly better than the other ones. Yeah,
you don't always know who it's going to be, but you can pretty much always bet on one of them. And so it's either going to be Trevon Walker this year or it's going to be Nolan Smith this year. And so that's worth noting as well. I mean, it's every single year. I mean, you had Azeez Ojulari last year, who just had an absolutely incredible season last year. So who will it be this year?
Well, and to kind of go in that conversation a little more too, I think the one that's going to be that guy, like the Azeez Ojulari, I think that's going to be your Adam Anderson.
Yeah.
Because once again, he didn't have that many snaps in general. If you look at the season worth of work in a 10-game season, especially, the man already had 6.5 sacks as the backup behind somebody else that had 8 sacks. I mean, he's going to – I said this after that game against Cincinnati. I've said it in the offseason. I'm going to say it again in my season predictions. He's definitely having double – I'll cement in that he's going to have double-digit sacks this year. Adam Anderson will have double-digit sacks this year. So the fact that he's going for 20 doesn't surprise me, and it should be very terrifying for opposing teams because he's going to get more time on the field than ever before, and he's going to be the name to watch as an edge rusher. Now, Nolan Smith is going to be make or break season for him.
Yeah.
And I think a great game to watch is going to be this one.
For sure.
To see how he plays against Clemson. Actually, I think Brooks Austin wrote an article for SI today. I think it came out, was talking about Nolan Smith and this being his best chance to have a breakout game to show what he can do because he hasn't had as many opportunities throughout his career yet. And it hasn't really lived up to the name that everybody kind of expected out of high school, which I'm not one throwing a towel on the kid. I think he's still fantastic. I think he's going to have a good year. I do think it's a good year for him. He's not going to be the edge rushing like mastermind this year because I do think that's Adam Anderson. But to continue the conversation that we've had in general with defensive line and front seven versus the other opposing team's offensive line, yeah, Georgia's had a bunch of question marks there, which we'll get into who we think is starting that game and going into the position groups there for Georgia as well. But for Clemson, and I'm going to butcher the names if I don't look real quick, so I'm going to pull it up real quick as well. At their center, they're going to be rotating centers. So they have Mason Trotter and Hunter Rayburn. They're alternating centers in this game. They have an or and a both kind of thing on their depth chart. That's what they're doing. You match that up with trying to, one, you don't rotate offensive linemen. You don't really do that in any level of football. It doesn't really work like that. Brooks Austin talked about this one day, and he was saying he wants them holding hands, going to the bathroom together, kind of thing. Like the offensive lineman, like your right guard, left guard, or center and left guard kind of combination, your left tackle and your right guard or left guard. They need to be working together, and it becomes a relationship that they build throughout the season. And if you're alternating back and forth at those position groups, it doesn't work. Like it causes extra holes because you need to know where that other person's going to be at all times. And if you're alternating, it kind of throws off how everybody has a slightly different style of play. Mm-hmm. And if two people are playing next to you and they alternate and they're different, you're going to have blown assignments and stuff like that along with it. And they're both sophomores, aren't they? Then we look at that.
Yes, they both are sophomores. And then also, you're rotating
Jordan Davis going up against.
That's what I was just about to say. You're rotating the guy that is going to be lined up across Jordan Davis every single time. So you want to talk about if you blow an assignment. If you blow an assignment on Jordan Davis, that's a real big problem.
You're in trouble,
literally and figuratively.
You're in trouble, and I think they do it a lot anyways with them. But you'll probably see Jordan Davis line up at a true zero technique, which is directly in front of the center like that. Because it's going to be extremely difficult for that center, especially if they're alternating. I don't know how they're going to alternate. I don't know if they're doing it by drive, by quarter, by half. I don't know what their thing is. But if they start alternating by drives or quarters or something too quickly, they're going to have a serious problem.
It would worry me if I was a Clemson fan to hear that.
I don't like alternating offensive linemen as a whole, but you put your center, which is a huge piece. The left tackle's one of the most important positions of the entire team as well, because it's the blind side of the quarterback most of the time, and they have to do a lot of in pass protection. But your center is extremely important. Your center is a captain on the team, in the sense of they're telling everybody around him what they're doing. If you watch the best centers in the game and the teams that have really good teams, their centers are always really good, and their centers are sitting here calling out, blitzes and all kinds of stuff for their offensive line, Mike IDs, for their running backs, for everybody. Like you'll see them almost altering the play at the line of scrimmage because they have to be similar to a quarterback in that sense, being able to get up there, see what the other team lines up with, and do it. So you start alternating stuff. To me, that's the quickest way for you to just ruin your offensive line play.
Have something horribly go wrong. Definitely.
Yeah. And somebody asked us, actually, Mikey B in the Discord chat over there for Brooks Austin's Patreon stuff. He actually, one of the things he brought up, which is why we talk about this now, was the center, which team does a better job with the quarterback center exchange. I mean, in that case, Georgia does way better.
Yeah.
You start alternating centers with your quarterback, and your quarterback, having a different center in front of him. Maybe he pulls his hands too quick against one guy that he wouldn't have with the other one. It would have been fine. But all of a sudden, the other center, he pulled his hands too quick or something. The ball goes flying, or just there's so many ways that could go wrong in that case when you start alternating like that. Mm-hmm. And then you put big Jordan Davis in front of that person at the same time.
Yeah,
that's a wrap.
Oh yeah, you already have enough on your hands as a center against Georgia with who you're lining up against. So then, if all their attention goes on to him for one play, and you forget about a blitzing linebacker, you don't find someone coming off the edge, who knows what could happen? Something disastrous could happen that could absolutely change the game. So I don't know that I've ever heard of rotating centers. Me and you actually talked about someone had asked us about rotating offensive linemen, and do we think Georgia's going to do that very often? And we both said, you really don't rotate offensive linemen, but yet Clemson and Dabo Swinney have decided that they want to rotate the centers. So that'll definitely be something to watch out for.
But yeah, you don't really see people alternate centers like that. So It'll be interesting to see how that goes for them. That could be a deciding factor of the game, because that could mean that Jordan Davis has a much better game because of it.
Yeah, or just even the front seven in general for Georgia. You talked about how, if you want to make a statement for yourself, get your name out there, this would be the game to do it. And we'll kind of move on to our next key matchup that me and you both agreed on is Tyke Smith is more than likely out. There was some buzz going around that possibly he plays, but he's not going to be playing this week. So Latavius Burney is more than likely going to step in. I think that's a great opportunity for Latavius Burney to come in. I mean, he's also someone that he's been around for quite a while, hasn't necessarily been given a shot. We got to see a really good glimpse of him against Cincinnati, and he played really well in that game. But you're talking about him going up against someone like Justin Ross for the entire game. You want to make a name for yourself, you can go out and just absolutely ball out against one of the best college wide receivers this week. So I think that's another name to be watching for Georgia is how well does Latavius Burney match up against Justin Ross? What does he do?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of Georgia fans probably didn't even know, except your diehard Georgia fans that followed everything with Georgia, probably didn't even know Latavius Bernie's name until that Clemson game, because he didn't do anything for Georgia up to that point, really. And that wasn't his fault. That was because of Tyreek Stevenson and Mark Webb playing in front of him at star. And then we had Richard LeCount and a list of safeties.
Have a lot of depth there for a while.
At safety between like J.R. Reed and all of those position people that have been in front of him at both safety and star. I mean, he didn't really have the opportunity to do so. So then when Tyreek Stevenson transfers out, he has his chance to step up against Cincinnati, and he did it. This is a huge, huge opportunity for him. That young man can make a name for himself immediately. I don't think he gets a lot of trouble in this game in general, like in the sense that you walk away from it and say he's not good. But I think he's going to play well in general. But he has a chance to really cement his name in Georgia's history books as being, somebody that people remember the name and think about when they think back to these types of matchups for Georgia. He has a chance to do that. Yep. And I think he's capable. He showed a lot of talent in that game against Cincinnati. And I think that he's going to have a great season. I do think he has a great season wherever he plugs in, because Tyke Smith will come back, so he won't be your starting star nickelback kind of thing for the entire year. But he will be a factor on this team because he'll shift into different positions throughout the year.
Yeah, and then also to go off of this as well, don't go into the game with the expectations of, okay, well, Latavius Bernie is going to absolutely lock down Justin Ross. Don't go in with that expectation, because it's not going to happen.
Justin Ross is having his big plays.
Justin Ross is going to get his. He's going to get his receptions. He'll get open. He'll get his. What you really want to focus on is that when Justin Ross does get his, you want to make sure that it's for 10 yards, for 8 yards, or maybe 15. You don't want him be getting his game breaker 50-plus yard receptions that go to the house. So when you're watching that, or when you're being critical of like, okay, how is Bernie doing? If Justin Ross is getting his receptions, that's fine. That's going to happen. I mean, when you're as talented as Justin Ross is, you're going to find ways to get his. Offensive coordinators are going to make sure that you're getting your best playmaker the ball. The key is that when you go up against someone like Justin Ross, where they like to run a lot of screens with him, they pretty much just get him the ball and let him go to work. You have to make sure that you meet him immediately and you limit his yards. So that's the big key for Latavius Bernie, is that when Justin Ross does get the ball, what do you do after that? If you're missing tackles, if you're not staying in your assignment, if you're in the wrong spot, then that's an issue. But I think he'll be fine in that aspect as well. I think he'll have a really good game, and I think this is a part of his career where people really start some buzz around Latavius Bernie's name.
I think so too, and I think it gives him a great chance to do something and kind of make an argument for having more playing time in different places. He could put it in a spot where like Kirby Smart and everybody and Dan Lanning and everyone has to kind of look at it and say, all right, well, he needs to be on the field. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton of places you can put him because, like I said, I mean, if you look at safety, you got Chris Smith and Lewisine. They're not coming off the field that much. Because Georgia doesn't really – the same way you don't really rotate offensive linemen, you don't see Georgia rotating safeties. They might have one safety on the field or something instead of two, rarely. But you're not going to see like just constant rotation at that position group. So he doesn't have a ton of opportunity there to come in. And at star is when, depending on what happens with Tyke Smith, he's got an injury with his foot and he had to have a surgery with it. So supposedly a few weeks kind of thing. But by the time he comes back, think about day to day. The kid had surgery and Kirby Smart comes out and says he's day to day.
Gotta love it.
I mean, that's weeks at least. I mean, if he broke his foot and then he had to have surgery on his, not day to day, that's weeks. But anyways, if he's out for 3, 4, 5 weeks, at that point you're, a big chunk of the way through the season. Bernie very well could make the argument that he needs to be on the field a lot, and it could make it hard for Tyke Smith to really squeeze back in. I think he will because he's an All-American from,
That's why you brought him in. You brought him in to play. So.
The Big 12, like All-American, in a pass raid like system out that way, he's going to be back on the field, but he will make it very difficult for him in those first few games if he can come out and maybe slow down Justin Ross as much as possible. It's one of those things that you're trying to bend and not break with Justin Robinson because he's going to get his stats. He's going to have his catches, like you said a few minutes ago. that's not going to be up for discussion whether or not he's going to have a good game himself or not.
Yeah.
You just can't let him get those. We can't bust plays.
Can't get beat over the top.
Yeah,
of him.
You can't have him streaking right down the seam and the safeties are split and all of a sudden Bernie's nowhere to be found and then he gets a 50, 60-yard touchdown because of it. That's what you can't live with, because those are the ones that'll be the killer back-breaking moments for you. For either side of the teams, by the way, like if Georgia does something similar, that could also break the back of Clemson kind of thing. That they can't let that happen either. Not a lot, at least. I mean, if it's one time and you shut them down in other ways, you're fine. But typically, I don't think either team's shut down in this game. I think it's going to be a fun one to watch in that aspect of it. But you can't let that happen all night long, and which means Bernie really has to step up there to see what he can do. And I'm excited to see what he can do. Once again, I like him. After Tyreek Stevenson left and before Tyke Smith came to Georgia, we were sitting there on our show talking about Bernie and how we were excited to see him step into that role. You know, we liked what we saw against Cincinnati. He gets the chance again.
Yep.
I'm extremely excited for him.
Big stage.
I think it's a great opportunity for him, and I think he's going to do well.
Absolutely. Yes, I completely agree. And so I think all around the secondary will do a good job, only because, I mean, a big MO for a Georgia secondary is we're fine with getting beat underneath, or not necessarily getting beat underneath, but they can have the underneath stuff. That's fine. We just don't want to give up that big play. So I don't think Georgia necessarily needs to worry about giving up that big play to Clemson, just because they always do so well with it. And their corners are really good at it. I mean, during the entire time when Tyson Campbell and Eric Stokes were here, you very rarely, if never, saw either of those two give up big plays over the top, unless they either trip or fall. That was the only instances where you saw them get beat deep. So I think that Georgia will be able to contain somewhat of Clemson's passing game. You're not going to be able to completely shut it down, as I said, of course, just because DJ is a very talented quarterback. He is an athlete, and he is going to make his plays just like Justin Ross is going to as well. And Clemson just has a really good offense, but it's going to be all about limiting those big plays and getting a stop when you need it. So I think Georgia will be fine on that aspect in regards to secondary and passing game, just because they really excel at stopping those two aspects of an offense. So I think the matchup there will be fine. And then, of course, like we said, key matchup there would be Latavius Burney.
I agree. And to kind of go back to like the front seven conversation and everything as well, one thing to keep in mind, Georgia fans, is DJ is one, he's bigger than I thought.
Yeah.
He's 6'4", 250. That's a big boy, so he's not exactly the easiest to bring down.
No.
He is pretty good at extending plays to find somebody downfield. He's not like, I'm not saying he's going to sit here and just run around in circles and scramble everywhere and run for 50, 60 yards against Georgia, but he can extend plays with his legs to find somebody open to throw to pretty well, and that could be a big difference in the game as well if Georgia's front seven struggles to keep him contained, which is where, you know, it'll be interesting to see Nolan Smith in the contained side of it, and that kind of game, that's going to be a big factor as well. If they can kind of keep him in the pocket area and kind of push in that way rather than letting him get outside, extend plays with his legs. And because at that point, it does become a matchup of defensive backs versus wide receivers, because if you're asking them to cover for 5 seconds out there, you try to cover Justin Ross for 5 seconds and think he's not going to get open. And he's got experience to find the gaps in the zone defenses and the holes out there for DJ to find him, to throw it to him as well. So that's where, if the front seven isn't playing well against that offensive line, it then trickles into the performance of defensive backs and wide receivers. And that's why that position area between both sides, the front seven, is going to be the deciding factor on it. I genuinely think that that's the case, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. One thing that Clemson does pretty well with that, I mean, let's just real quick, the names on it, because you're going to know these names. Just think about this defensive front for Clemson right here. I mean, you got Miles Murphy, Xavier Thomas, KJ Henry, Brian Brzee, who I believe, we were talking about this earlier and I didn't check it to confirm, but I believe he got first team All-American stuff ahead of Jordan Davis in the preseason as well. So, I mean, they've got a lot of talent at the defensive line, which is why we say that they probably have, the edge on Georgia in the sense of their actual defensive line itself. But those guys are really good at getting pressure on a quarterback. So if Georgia's offensive line isn't playing well against that front seven and that defensive line, and you have JT Daniels out here running for his life, which he's pretty elusive in the pocket as well. We watched it. Just go back and watch the Mississippi State game where he's coming off of his knee injury stuff, and his first game back, just watch him move in the pocket and watch him just make plays with his legs to open up the plays with his arm.
Yeah, looks can be deceiving with him in regards to that.
He's pretty athletic in that sense. I don't think you see him scramble a ton because he's not that guy. But once again, he's going to find the open receivers by doing stuff with his legs. And if he can kind of be elusive against these guys on the defensive line of Clemson as well, it could make a big difference for them that way. So it's going to be a fun one to watch as a whole. But I do think that Georgia's going to do a little bit better getting pressure on the quarterback, in my opinion. I think that even though Georgia has its issues with its offensive line, which we haven't got into yet, we'll go into that next, I think that they're going to have a better chance against Clemson's defensive front than Clemson has on their offensive line versus Georgia's defensive front. I think Georgia's going to do a great job rushing the passer as well. I think the linebackers are going to be a huge impact in the sense that I think that they could help close off the edges and seal the gaps from the running game. And you brought this up earlier. We were talking about it. The games, if you look back on the ones that Clemson loses, it's because their run game isn't working very well. Because they're averaging, less than 2 yards carry kind of thing on their run game. Georgia has a better chance at shutting down Clemson's run game than Clemson has shutting down Georgia's run game.
No doubt.
And if you can't shut down Georgia's run game, JT Daniels is going to light you up.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have to play the run more, and that's a dangerous one to do with these wide receivers, tight ends, and JT Daniels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime, especially now, like past UGA teams, it was all about, we'll just stop the run. If you can stop Georgia from running the ball, you're probably going to be okay against them. Now it doesn't matter if we stop the run; they can still pass. But if you allow them to excel at both, and you leave both of them open, and
600 yards of offense later,
that's a real problem, and that's where this comes into play for Georgia. Of why everybody is saying this could very well be the year for Georgia, just because we've never seen Georgia have this type of offense before, where you really don't know what could happen with them. They are not as predictable as they have been in the past years, and especially when you consider that their running back room is as deep as it's ever been, arguably. And then they also have running backs that can kill you in the passing game and in the running game. So Georgia provides a lot of issues at the running back position that I don't think Clemson has the edge in regards, because because of how many different types of players Georgia has in their running back room, between James Cook, who's really well in the passing game, and then you have Zamir White and Kendall Milton, who are both really good in the run game, and then also maybe can get involved in the passing game. And then someone like McIntosh, who can do it both and can do both really well. I just think that gives them a serious edge in the run game versus Clemson, where you're kind of figuring out your identity still a little bit there for their running backs. And so I think with that alone also, I think that gives Georgia a big advantage in their offense versus Clemson's offense, just because of how unpredictable they can be now with all the players that they have on offense.
Yeah, I do think that that's a great point as well, because Georgia can go out there and they have Zamir White, they have Kendall Milton, they have James Cook, they have Kenny McIntosh, and you can keep going down the list of different players at running back for Georgia. That's just the top four. And you can keep going down the list of every one of them that can come in there and run pretty well on first, second down. You have several of them can come in and catch out of the backfield, which I'll get into this in a second. I won't spoil it yet. There's somebody in the Georgia backfield that I think is going to be a lot more involved in the passing game than people expect this year, and I'll get into that as well. There's been a lot of reports out of spring ball, fall camp about him in the pass game. So we'll get into that at the end of it, because I've got our season predictions coming up there. So there's any of them basically can do that as well. So you have that unpredictability when the backs are out there, and then you add in that they also have a lot of weapons, at wide receiver, tight end, with JT Daniels. I think that they can be very, very balanced if they want to. They can also go one or the other. They can be run heavy, they can be pass heavy, but it'll be interesting to see which way they lean in this game. It'll be interesting to see what the split is as far as, if it ends up being a close game, you might see a little bit more passing, depending on if Georgia's trailing or leading. You might see them trying to air it out a little bit more. But if they have a lead, you could end up seeing them running the ball 60% of the time, because they're trying to get the clock going. And the game itself will determine the splits for Georgia. Yeah. For the first time, I can confidently say that Georgia, which way it goes is based on how the game itself is going, because of what they're trying to do, if they're trying to catch back up or if they're trying to run away with it and let the clock milk out. Because as far as like the scheme, Todd Monken is going to be, you don't know which way he can go either way if he wants to, which also is going to play a factor of how that offensive line is doing, which we'll transition into as well. It'll be interesting to see Georgia's offensive line because there's been a lot of questions, Warren Erickson having his injury with his hand and being in a cast and stuff like that. You're not going to see him at center, which brings the question of who's going to be the starting center for Georgia, which we'll tell you our thoughts on that as well. But all of that kind of playing in, Georgia's offensive line has been a big question mark for Georgia the past couple of years. It'll be very interesting to see how it plays out against such a good defensive front and front seven of Clemson. But I'll kick it over to you with some of the position areas for Georgia's offensive line. Starting at center, I don't think it's much of a question anymore who is going to step in to help with Warren Erickson being out, or not necessarily out. He's limited participation, basically, is what Brooks Austin posted on Sports Illustrated today. So you might see him slip in at guard or something like that, but you're not going to see him play center with his hand having issues.
Yeah, so we just did a quick Google search, actually, just to kind of verify what we were going to talk about in regards to who comes in and replaces Warren Erickson. We had a pretty good idea, but Cedric Van Pran is more than likely who we think is going to be playing in the center spot and going to be taking over the snaps for the offense. And it is, I mean, to put in someone like Van Pran against Clemson for like his first start of his career, it might cause you to worry just a little bit, but he's a tremendous athlete. He's a tremendous player, and you might see him struggle a little bit early on. I mean, that's kind of expected. I mean, first game of the season, first big opportunity for his, of course, but I think this is a great game for him as well, just as we've been saying this, is that if you want to make a name for yourself, do it against someone like Clemson. So I think this is a great opportunity for Van Pran to really establish himself. It's going to give him great experience to go against someone like Brissy, of course, who's going to be lined up against him probably throughout the game. And so, but then I think also it's year 2 with Matt Luke as your offensive line. And as you said, there were some struggles with the offensive line last year. They were pretty good in pass protection, but where it was really concerning was the run game, which was something that we hadn't seen in a long time for Georgia, is that they struggled to block in the run game. So year 2 with Matt Luke, I think you kind of really see them settle in. They're starting to get their players in who they want up front blocking for them. And so I think you'll see them kind of really get into a groove this year. I think they will play better than they did last year in some aspects of the game. And I think all around, I mean, what better way to test yourself than go against someone like Clemson's defensive line? So it's a big test for Georgia's offensive line, but I think they're going to perform pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the questions that we were asked as well is if Georgia was the starting offensive line, and then the second question of it was like if Georgia rotates and stuff. I don't think Georgia really rotates a lot, but the names that you could see if they were to kind of slip some extra people in, like you could see some younger people get out there and have their chance to do something you may not have seen before. With Cedric Van Pran being most likely starting center because Erickson is going to be, if he's in the game, it's not going to be center. So that leaves him there as the number 2 center for Georgia right now. Probably going to have somebody like Sawyer at left tackle, Schaefer at left guard, which then center we just talked about. Right guard, you could see Tate Ratledge be out there for them. And then Warren McClendon at right tackle is what you're probably going to see out there. But you could always see a Clay Webb, get inserted somewhere in there. He hasn't done a ton of playing in actual, key moments, meaningful snaps kind of thing. He could get himself in there. There was talks about him in center. That's what he came in as. But I don't know that you'll see him there as well. We'll have to see how stuff plays out. There's a few guys. Amaris Mims could get in the game as well if you were to be rotating and everything like that. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out for Georgia. I do think that they roll with 5 and try to stick with that unless they need to rotate for some reason. I don't think Georgia's going out there planning to rotate offensive linemen. No. I don't think that that's a way to succeed in a big game like this against a defensive line like that. So I think they're going to stick with 5 when they do. Whoever it is, if it's not the same group that I just said, it'll be whatever group it is going to be in there 99% of the time, unless something happens.
Yep, I completely agree with that. I mean, like we've been pounding the drum. It's going to be a battle of the trenches, and so it's really going to be about which offensive line really steps up and which defensive line can create the most havoc. So questions on both sides for both teams, and then also dealing with some injuries for both teams. So it'll be interesting to see which team steps up in that aspect. And whichever team does, I think they're going to come out victorious in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be a fun one to watch once again. I think that – all right, well, I'm going to – instead of tiptoeing around anymore, we're going to go ahead and jump into predictions of it because we've been on –
That's what they've been
about
on
an
for
hour.
Probably.
It's right on an hour mark. It's 8:40. If you've listened to the whole thing, you've probably been waiting for this part anyways. Well, if you're like me, you probably like the in-between
Maybe
stuff
you don't
as well.
care about our opinions.
Maybe you've seen enough predictions you really don't care what other people think is going to happen. But guess what? If you're still with us this far, you're going to get to hear them now anyways. Let's start with season prediction stuff first, and then we'll jump into the actual game final predictions to wrap up the show. How about that? So let's start with offense, right? So JT Daniels, we'll just do over-under for some spots, and then we'll do like a prediction for who's going to lead in whatever category we want. First thing we'll do is an over-under JT Daniels passing yards this season. I'm going to say over-under 3,600 yards regular season.
Over. Hammering the over right now. I'll go ahead and tell you. I'm hammering the over on that
In
one.
regular season?
Oh,
or total season?
Just regular season? I might have him right around 3,600, but I think he definitely ends the season over 3,600 yards without a doubt.
I'll do it this way because I agree with you on that. Because if you're gonna do whole season, I'm gonna set the over under whole season at 4,000 yards.
I think he's right around that mark. I think he's right around there.
I agree. I think he might slightly go over that. I think he's gonna edge that out. Statistically, if you were to just look at his body of work last year and you look at in 4 games. He had 1,200 and something yards, or like 1,200 yards, so averaging 300 yards a game already. So then you take that by the body of work throughout the whole season, and he's definitely over 4,000 yards in the full season because Georgia, if they're playing 12 regular season games. You look at it being in the SEC championship game, that's 13 playoff game being 14, potentially 15 games. If he plays 15 games, you got to watch out for 4,500 yards.
Yeah,
or higher in this offense that I think Georgia's rolling out there, especially if you start getting people like Darnell Washington, Eric Gilbert, and maybe even a Pickens late in the season.
Maybe even George Pickens.
Maybe even a George Pickens
Midway.
by SEC championship game.
Yeah.
At that point, you could be looking 4,500 yards.
Fully loaded.
I think it's
offense.
An over on the 4,000 yard mark at that time.
I agree with that as well.
So we'll do running back in general, and then we'll go specific. Running back being over 1,000 yards this year.
A running back.
I'll go ahead and
1,000
yard running back.
I'll go ahead and give.
You don't have to say a name yet.
I'll go ahead and give you a name right now. So I was kind of skeptical of if any Georgia running back would get over 1,000 yards rushing this year. But I'll go ahead and tell you, if a Georgia running back gets over 1,000 yards this year, it'll be Kendall Milton.
Kendall Milton?
I'm going with Kendall Milton. I think Kendall Milton becomes pretty much your head guy in the running game by the end of the year.
Listen, if Kendall Milton has 1,000 yards,
this is what I'm going with.
If Kendall Milton has 1,000 yards, and I'm not hating on this because I would love to see it. I think he is capable. Don't get me wrong. He's extremely talented. It would take him potentially taking a ridiculous amount of the carries by the end of the season to get there.
That's what I said. If. I don't know that a Georgia running back gets to 1,000 yards this year, just because there's so many of them.
I'll start by saying I do think Georgia has 1,000-yard running back this year. Because even just out of the body of work last year with the issues that there was with the offense as a whole and the way everything went, including an 8-yard rushing performance for the team against the Mississippi State, you still had Zamir White that on pace for 1,000-yard season last year. But in 10 games, he was pushing on there. So I do think Georgia as a whole definitely has 1,000-yard back, one of them. My opinion is I think Zamir White has 1,000-yard season. If it's going to be one of them that part, because if Kendall Milton has 1,000 yards, I think you've got 2 backs at 1,000 yards.
Very well could, yeah. I mean, easily. But yeah, that's just my bold prediction for the year.
I like it. Don't get me wrong.
But if
that happens to me, once again, if that happens, I think that borderline 2 1,000-yard backs. If not, it's going to be real close. If it's just one of them and it is Kendall Milton and Zamir White doesn't get up there, he's still going to have 800 yards, 900 yards.
Oh yeah, I think you'll have a lot of guys close to it probably.
I think you'll have 2 of them around that 1,000-yard mark in regard of it, if Kendall Milton gets up there himself. But I do think that Zamir White is still going to have a big season in the backfield. I think he's shown a lot of stuff.
Without a doubt.
I think he's shown a lot of stuff in the spring and then the fall camp stuff where he looks a lot more elusive. And even late in the season last year, he looked like he was making people miss again. And I think that was something that he was kind of missing with his knees, and he was just kind of getting the feel back for it. He was more trying to run through people more rather than trying to run around people. But late in the season and then in the spring and fall, he's shown that he's very elusive still. And if he lets that fly like he can and like he did out of high school, it could be dangerous for opposing teams.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
So I'll say that I think that that's the way that goes there. Wide receiver, do you think Georgia gets a 1,000-yard wide receiver this year?
Does Georgia get a
with everything
1,000-yard receiver?
Playing out the way that it is? Pickens is down, Washington out. He wouldn't get 1,000 yards anyways, but I'm just using his name. Eric Gilbert out for I don't know how long. We don't know what's going on there.
So I just want to preface this. I do not believe Georgia has ever had a 1,000-yard receiver.
They've had one.
One? They've had one.
Terrence Edwards was the one and only Georgia receiver to go over 1,000 yards.
One receiver ever. Just want to preface that by saying
that's an important detail. It is.
Yeah. But we've also been saying this. Georgia has never had an offense like they have this year.
Georgia could throw the ball more than 50% of the time this year for the first time
in
God knows how long.
Yeah, gosh knows how long. So I think yes. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I think Georgia does have a 1,000-yard receiver this year. And,
there's one guy it has to be.
It's got to be Jermaine Burton, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Jermaine Burton's going to be the guy. If someone does it, it'll be Jermaine Burton.
Yeah. If somebody's doing it at this point, it's got to be Jermaine Burton because of the other injuries and absent players that we've just talked about as well. So if you're going to have one, it's Jermaine Burton. So, and I think he could, especially with some of the stuff as the screen is starting to flicker on our camera now. Sorry about that if you're watching. I don't know what's going on there. The lights flicker too. Maybe it's storming outside. I don't know. But if with all of the different injury stuff and everything as well, Brooks Austin came on the show and he said that he thought Georgia was going to have 2 1,000-yard receivers with Pickens.
He said that early
He said that
in
in the spring.
Yeah.
I'm talking spring ball before Pickens was hurt, obviously, because he didn't say this after Pickens got hurt. So this was before spring ball that he said that Pickens and Burton went over 1,000 yards, and he thought even they could go 1,200 yards kind of thing with Georgia this year and Todd Monken. So I think it's very safe to say Georgia has a 1,000-yard receiver, and I think it's extremely safe to say that guy would be Jermaine Burton at this point if somebody's doing it.
Definitely.
And I think he does because of the other people being hurt around him. He's going to be the number one guy at first.
Definitely.
For a while. So that's going to give him a great start on it to try to get to that 1,000-yard mark. Last one we'll do before we jump into the actual game predictions here is who leads the team in total offense. We talked about this.
We did.
Way back, early episode. I'm talking like winter almost. Like it's way before spring, before spring ball started.
Like beginning of the podcast.
This was the same episode that Brooks came on and he said that the 2,000-yard receivers, and we talked about, because that was the whole discussion, who is going to lead Georgia in total offense in 2021. A lot has changed since then. The season's starting now. Who's it going to be?
Well, so my pick at the beginning of the year was George Pickens. So obviously I can't pick George Pickens anymore just because I'd look like an idiot if I told you George Pickens right now was going to lead Georgia in offense. So who do I think will lead the team in offense now? If we're talking a 1,000-yard receiver for Jermaine Burton, I think that Jermaine Burton's probably going to lead your team in total offense, I think. But, there's just a lot to factor in because with how much Todd Monken uses his running backs also into the passing game, it's really hard to pick because if you have someone like Kendall Milton, as we just said, or Zamir White go 1,000 yards rushing and then they tack on another 300 in the passing game, then that's where things really get interesting. So I think mine would have to be probably a toss-up between Jermaine Burton and then, maybe Zamir White or Kendall Milton, in my opinion. It's really hard to say. But I probably would lean towards a running back if I had to guess. But, yeah, that's where I'd lean towards for that. I have a feeling who you're going to say, though.
You already know who I'm going to say.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to say Zamir White because this is what I said to begin with when we first did this, and I'm sticking to it, and that's what I hinted at a little bit ago.
People kind of doubted you a little bit.
Everyone doubted me. I was the only one that said a running back in the first place, and then all three of y'all said George Pickens.
I backed you up. I backed you up a little bit. I did say if there's a running back that's going to do it, I said it'll be Zamir White. I did back you up a little bit on that.
You did say that, I will say, but I'm sticking to it because I'm still – I'm even more confident at this point than I was then, because the big argument at that point, all three of y'all said it was going to be George Pickens at the time as well. I think
it would have been.
It was very possible.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not arguing that it.
Yeah.
You know, at this point in time, if he was still healthy, it would potentially spark a different discussion right now. But Zamir White, I think, is going to be your 1,000-yard back. And like I was hinting at a minute ago, there's a running back that has been a lot more involved in the passing game throughout spring and fall.
Saw it in Cincinnati, I believe.
You saw it in Cincinnati, and you saw that's part of what I meant earlier when I talked about the elusiveness of him. He caught some balls, and when he had the ball in his hands outside because of screenplays and that stuff, he was out there making people miss with his legs after catching the ball. So you saw it a little bit in that game, and then in the spring, we've heard a lot about the screen game and the pass game that he's been involved in there, and then it kept going in later on into the fall camps. And I heard it again this week that somebody said that there was a lot of screenplay in a scrimmage. I was told that there were screenplays drawn up for him, and he was making plays and he was looking good. That's what we were told. So I think that he's that guy, and if he does have a 1,000-yard rushing season, he's going to have 200-300 yards receiving as well. That's my hot take. There's your hot take. At the beginning of the show, you listened to the intro, and it said, prepare for these hot takes. There's your hot take for the season right there. Zamir White, 1,000 yards, and then 200 to 300 yards receiving.
There you go.
That's your take.
There
Clip
you
it.
have it.
Bookmark it. As our girl Sierra would say, be the librarian, because you bookmark everything.
Yes.
Bookmark that. I'm going to keep that myself, and I'm going to bring it back up at the end of the season. So, without further ado, we're about an hour and 10 or 12 minutes into it, maybe hour 15 at this point. Predictions for the game on Saturday. Voice crack. Predictions for the game. It has not been a smooth episode for us tonight. There has been a lot of hiccups. This is a blooper-filled episode. Predictions for the game on Saturday. We'll start with an over-under offense for Georgia. Over-under total offensive yards, 400.
Total offensive yards?
Total offensive yards, over 100.
I think you're going to – I'll say over 400.
I agree, over 400.
I think if Georgia wins this game, you're probably going to see JT Daniels throw around the 350-yard mark, and then you're easily getting over 50 rushing yards, I think, as well.
For sure.
I think you definitely have over on that area for total offense of Georgia.
Total offense, I think that's a good spot. So for passing yards, I'm going to set the over-under at 320.
Over.
For Daniels?
Yeah, I'll say over 320.
Okay. I agree that I think it's going to be really close. That's why I set that mark there. I think he's going to be probably around the 300 mark, roughly. It could be slightly under, slightly over kind of thing, but 320. I'm going to say under. I'm going to say under 320 because I think it's more the upper 200s, maybe like 295, somewhere around there, maybe 300. And the reason I say that because I do think that the over-under on the offense is going to be, the over at 450. I said, no, what did I say? 400. I said 400, not 450. 400. The over-under I'm setting for rushing yards in the game, I'm setting at 150.
150?
For Georgia. As a team, not one player.
No, yeah, I know.
As a team.
150. Jeez. I might have to say under on that one. But like you said, a lot of this is going to be predicated on where Georgia's at in the game. If you're up 2 scores in the third
rushing
quarter,
yards will stack, yeah,
you're going to stack up on your rushing yards. You're not running as many plays probably. You're really taking your time. Whereas if you're down a score in the third quarter, you're letting the ball air out, and you're probably getting to the line a lot quicker, which I think Georgia will do in this game. So, I think I might roll with the under on that one.
I like it. See, this is where our disagreement is on like the way the outcome of the game is, because I think it's over because I think Georgia has one of the backs. And I'm not saying Zamir White, and I'm not saying Kendama, because I don't know. It really depends on somebody can get a big play in general. But I think one of the running backs is going to be really, really pushing 100 yards, if not breaking 100 yards themselves. And the other ones combined will definitely add up to be the 50 mark. That's my thinking behind that, and that's why I also say that Daniels is under 320, maybe just under the 300 mark on passing, because I do think that Georgia's going to get those big plays in the run game. I think there's going to be a 30-yard run, a 40-yard run that could break out, maybe a touchdown, that kind of thing in the running game, and that's why I'm going to put that. I'm going to say just over 150 Not like a ton over 150. I probably shouldn't have set the over-under at 150. Should have been a little bit lower maybe. But I do think they potentially go over 150 because I do think one running back hits right around that 100-yard mark, which once again is why I think that they probably get close to between the 400 and 450 total offensive mark as well. So then you got to look at the game itself now, right? What's your score prediction and who wins?
Score prediction. All right. I've had quite a few weeks to think about this, and I've been
We've had a year. We've been thinking about the youth.
I know, but you
The
got to
whole
think
off season.
You got to think closer to the game,
I know,
because like a year ago you have
in spring. There's no way we were calling this game.
Exactly. So a few weeks to think about this now, and I've stayed around the same number mark for the score. But I am confident in saying that I think the score is going to be 38-31 a Georgia victory. That is my score prediction for the game.
It's not far from what I'm going to say.
Yeah, so I think 38-31, one-score game, and I think Georgia takes the victory in this one solely because as we went down this position to position for both teams, I just like Georgia's odds compared to the Clemson's. As I said, I like Georgia's offensive line matching up better against Clemson's than Clemson's offensive line matching up against Georgia's defensive line. And then also I think Georgia is really deep offensively in receivers. They're really deep in the run game. They have a legit quarterback now. Their defense is going to be legit. Not saying that, of course, Clemson's defense is legit as well, and they have tons of playmakers on offense as well. I just think when you put it down and match them up together, I think Georgia matches up better in multiple locations against Clemson. And I think that they're going to edge out the victory in this one and start the season off 1-0.
Yeah, I think that's a good prediction there. I'll go ahead and I think the score is going to be, I think the final score is going to be somewhere right around, the losing team's going to have maybe 28 is what I'm going to say. 28 for the losing team. The winning team's going to, I'll go ahead and give it, I'll say 35. I'll say 35-28. I'll give it a full touchdown. But I think it could be a field goal game. Yeah. I really think it's a field goal.
3-point.
I almost said maybe 31, like 28-31 with a game-winning field goal type thing. I think it's that close. I know there's been a lot of takes where people say, 14-point win for Clemson, 14-point win for Georgia. I saw today actually, 10-point win, that kind of thing. Whatever. I think it's 7 points. 8 points at most kind of thing, even a potential 3-point game. The team that's going to win is going to be whoever is going to break 30 points. I don't think both teams necessarily get 30, but I think one team, and I think Georgia gets it. I think Georgia edges them out. I say that with some hesitation in the sense that it's going to be a great game. It's going to be one, it's Georgia's biggest game of the season. It's Clemson's biggest game of the season.
Yep.
It might be the biggest game of the season across college football until we see how certain games play out to build the matchups later on. At least right now, looking at it, that's the second or the closest game I think is going to rival that. Late late year is going to be Alabama and Texas A&M.
For sure.
I think it could be a really big game just because it could decide the entire conference over on the West. But I think Georgia edges this one out in a close, either as few as 3 points, as most like 7 points. So my final score prediction will go 28-35 Georgia with I'm going to say it's a late touchdown.
So it's down to the wire for you.
It's a down to the wire game.
I agree with you.
It's a late touchdown for Georgia.
I've said before that I think these two teams are about as evenly matched as they get, and so I think because of that, it's just going to be a really close game the whole time. There's not going to be much breathing room here in this one at all. So those hearts are going to be pumping for every fan on both sides. So really great game. I mean, there's no better way to open up the season this way than to have a matchup like Georgia versus Clemson, two top 5 teams. Doesn't get any better than that. And so it's a great way to kick off college football this year. Looking forward to it. And it's going to be a fantastic game for sure.
And if you watched last week or listened last week, we alluded who was winning this game because we kept saying Georgia would either go 12-0 or 11-1. So this is me officially saying Georgia goes 12-0 in the regular season.
I agree.
And then Georgia's Georgia's in the playoffs this year. In my opinion, unless there's some unforeseen circumstance or something happens and derails the whole season on there, Georgia's in the playoffs. And the reason I say that, I think this game is extremely important for Georgia because it gives them the flexibility, though, that if they go 12-0 and they match up with an Alabama or Texas A&M in the SEC championship game, it gives them a little bit of breathing room in the sense that if they were to lose that game, they have a win against Clemson and an undefeated regular season. So then they'd be a one-loss runner-up in the SEC, which is what I'm not saying that'll happen because I'm not going to make a prediction on that game yet because I'm not even making 100%, if what's happening. Well, no, I kind of did. I said Alabama's going to go undefeated on their side. So I think it's a Georgia versus Alabama SEC championship game, 12-0, 12-0. And then I think both teams are making the playoffs because you're not leaving. If one of those games, both 12-0, 12-0, and then one lost team runner up in the SEC, they're making the playoffs. Unless the Pac-12
unless Oregon
Iowa
comes in there,
or Iowa State comes in and does something.
Better look out.
So my official Final Four is going to be Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, and Oklahoma because I don't see anybody upsetting Oklahoma in the Big 12, and unless North Carolina can upset Clemson in an ACC championship game, I don't see Clemson not making it either. And once again, the schedule and everything lined up. Georgia's going undefeated if we're right and they do get past Clemson with the win, they're going undefeated. The SEC West is also going to be the similar thing. Now, I will say this, because I'm not getting into my predictions of who wins the SEC championship game, if Georgia wins the national title, that kind of stuff. Way too early to say that. Georgia's going to play Bama in the SEC championship game. And if they say they do match up in a national championship game or a playoff game, one team's not winning both of those games.
It'd be really hard to, that's for sure.
One team's not winning, but I think they split those games. And so to be honest with you, if you're Georgia, you might want to lose the SEC championship game because if you win that one, I don't think you're, or just hope you don't match up with them in the playoffs again. But if you match up with Saban twice in the SEC championship game and then a playoff game, you're not winning both of them, and you really better hope you win the last one.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say, and I'll wrap that up. What's your Final Four? And then we will call it quits because we are about an hour and 20 right now.
I'll go on a different route. I think it's very possible that you see both Georgia and Alabama in the college football playoff. I think it's very likely that you see two SEC teams in there this season. But I'm going to go a different way. I like to be different and don't want to give you guys the same prediction because that's boring. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to go with either one SEC team, who obviously it's probably going to be Georgia or Alabama. And then I'm going to throw in Oklahoma, Ohio State, and Clemson. I say Ohio State just because every single year, they have a really good offense still. They have it figured out every single year offensively. And just also because of who their competition is in the Big Ten, I don't see anybody really matching up well with them really. And so I think they just run the table over there, and then they're sitting there at the end of the season. And you're just kind of like, all right, well, I think we got to put in probably an undefeated Ohio State team in. So I'll say Ohio State, and then Oklahoma, Clemson, and then whoever wins the SEC championship. Those are my four.
All right, you got to call one. You got to give me a Final Four.
A Final Four, I'm going with Georgia. I think Georgia's in there for sure.
We've been saying this since the spring. Since December almost. Definitely in January, you heard us sit here and sit down and say Georgia is a playoff team this year, or else it's going to feel like a letdown.
I think
the reason for that is because the way the season stacks up, the talent they have at this point, if they can't make the playoffs, it's going to be disheartening as a Georgia fan, and it's going to feel like they didn't live up to the capabilities they have. In the past, you can't say that they've failed you as fans and stuff like that. Whatever, they've lost some games and they didn't get as high as you had hoped, maybe. But this one would be if they don't make the playoffs. I'm gonna, as a Georgia fan myself, I'll be disappointed.
No, yeah,
and I'll think it's kind of let down.
As you should be.
Not calling a playoff win, not calling a national championship win, not saying that you have to demand that, but I am saying that you should, as a Georgia fan, I think it's fair to set the expectation at a playoff appearance.
No doubt, I agree with you 100%.
Anything we didn't cover that you want to cover real quick?
No, I'm good. I think I got everything off my chest today.
We talked a lot. It's been a long episode. Can't help. It's the beginning of the season. There's a lot to cover there. So hopefully you stuck with us the whole time. If not, hopefully you heard enough to kind of get your quick synopsis of what's going on in our minds here with the season and with this first week game. We'll wrap it up by saying, as always, keep it classy in the Classic City, and go Dogs.
Yes, sir.
Should have done this a minute ago, so you're watching this. I'm sorry. Here we go. I'm going to cut this, though.
Thank you for listening. listening to this week's episode of Dogs Daily on Sports Illustrated. Take a second to subscribe, rate, review, and share with your friends and family. Feel free to reach out to the Dogs Daily crew on Twitter with any topics you'd like discussed. You can reach out to Jeremiah at Jeremiah_Stod7, to Kyle at DK Fubderberg, and Jonathan at 22_Jman. Check back next week for a brand new episode. In the meantime, go Dogs!